She slid a folded note across the table, her fingertips barely touching the paper, and Richard Gere knew instantly it was trouble. At 76, the man still carries that dangerous calm, that slow smile that makes women lean in without meaning to, and men wonder what secret he is about to drop. For decades, he has played the kind of characters who leave storms behind them. But today, it is Richard himself stirring up the heat. During a quiet interview, the host asked him a question most actors dodge like fire. Who were the women he wanted but never had? The ones who lived in his mind long after the camera stopped. Richard did not blush. He did not hesitate. He leaned back, let that wicked glimmer rise in his eyes, and said he had 6 names, 6 actresses who could have pulled him into any room, any moment, with nothing more than a look. He said these were not harmless crushes. These were the kind of women a man risks reputation for, the kind who make you forget schedules, scripts, even common sense. Before we dive into the list, make sure you subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? 1. Julia Roberts. Her name does not simply arrive. It lands. It hits Richard Gere the way a sudden warm gust hits you when you open a door to a room you forgot was full of memories. The interviewer brings up her name and Richard moves before he speaks. His shoulders loosen just a little. His eyes soften. His mouth bends into that guilty curve that only appears when a man is remembering something he maybe should not be remembering at all. He finally says it, Julia Roberts. Not fast, not casual, slow. Like each syllable is something he knows he should not taste again, but cannot help savoring. Back in 1990, during the making of Pretty Woman, Julia was not just the breakout star of the moment. She was a phenomenon no studio executive could have predicted. 22 years old, barefoot half the time, laughing like she had not yet learned the word restraint. And somehow she walked into a soundstage and made a 40-year-old Richard Gere feel like he had been unplugged from the world he knew and plugged into something entirely new. Her laugh was not polite. It was not arranged. It was not crafted for a camera lens. It came straight from her ribs, warm and bright and reckless in the best possible way. Richard said being around her felt like standing next to a sparkler that did not know it was burning. She did not try to draw attention. She did not try to seduce anyone. She simply existed. And existing, for her, was already too much heat for any ordinary man to handle. He remembers one morning in mid-March, cold outside, hot lights inside. Julia sat cross-legged on the floor fiddling with a bootstrap, her hair a mess in the kind of way only she could pull off. No makeup except whatever survived from earlier that day, humming some random tune, not even in key. Just waiting for the next scene. She lifted her eyes to him. Just a look. And Richard said it was like someone reached inside his chest and flipped every switch he had. He forgot the people in the room. He forgot the lines taped to the side of the camera. He forgot he was Edward Lewis. For a few seconds, he was simply a man who did not know what to do with the feeling crawling up his spine. Then came the moment that stayed with him for decades. Julia reached out and touched his arm. Barely a touch. Light enough to miss if you blinked. But Richard swears it ran through him harder than any love scene he ever filmed. He joked later that if his heart had been connected to a machine, the medical team would have come sprinting in thinking something was wrong. But beneath the jokes was something heavier, something true. Richard admitted that being near Julia felt like standing on a balcony during a heat wave. You know you should step back, but you lean forward anyway. You always lean forward. She had this dangerous softness, a mix of innocence and spark that made the air around her feel charged, like a summer storm waiting to break it open. Their scenes did not feel rehearsed. They felt like collisions, half work, half instinct, all chemistry. The crew teased them often, whispering that if those two stayed close for too long, the film might become a documentary instead of a romance. Richard rarely disagreed. What knocked him down was not just her beauty, though he was not foolish enough to pretend it did not matter. It was the way she balanced lightness and fire, youth and certainty, humor and honesty. She could tell a joke that made him forget to breathe and then look at him with eyes so open he forgot how to speak. During the interview, he leaned forward, voice lowering into the kind of confession older men share only when they no longer care who is listening. He said people kept asking what happened between them, and he said they were asking the wrong thing. The real question was what almost happened. He paused, then smiled. That slow, dangerous smile of a man remembering a moment he barely stopped himself from following. There were days, he said, when he wondered what would happen if the room emptied out and only the two of them remained. Days when he felt the line between acting and wanting blur so much he had to remind himself where he was standing. And then he finished with a sentence that made the host freeze for a full breath. Julia Roberts could have undone me in 2 seconds, and I would not have resisted. Not then, not now, not ever. That was Julia, the first woman on his list, the spark he never truly walked away from. 2. Diane Lane. The moment her name is mentioned, Richard Gere reacts in a way he does not bother hiding. He lets out a soft laugh, not a polite laugh, a knowing laugh, the kind a man releases when he remembers something he never fully got over, something too real to pretend away. Diane Lane was not the safe kind of beautiful. She was the kind of beautiful that made a man hesitate before stepping closer. Not because she was distant, but because she felt like warmth pressed against danger. Her energy did not whisper. It lingered, and it clung to the air around her like perfume you can almost taste. Richard met her long before the film Unfaithful. They crossed paths at industry events, small dinners, charity nights, but it was not until the cameras rolled on that film that everything he thought he understood about chemistry, attraction, and self-control got rewritten. He remembers the first table read. Diane walked in wearing something simple, nothing designed to impress, and yet the entire room shifted. Richard said she had this pulse around her, a quiet pulse, the kind you feel first in your throat, then in your stomach, then everywhere else. During the early days of shooting, Richard found himself watching her more than he should have. Not in a disrespectful way, in a helpless way. Diane had this softness that held teeth underneath, a gentleness that hit a spark you knew could flare without warning. She had the kind of presence that made a man stand a bit straighter, breathe a little slower, think a little harder. Unfaithful was a dangerous film, not because of its story, but because of what the story awakened. Their scenes were written to be tense, intimate, loaded with betrayal. But Richard admitted something that surprised even him. The script was not the problem. The problem was that Diane made the script feel secondary, background noise. Something you followed only because the cameras forced you to. There was one afternoon on set he remembered with an almost embarrassed smile. Midday, warm studio lights, quiet space between takes. Diane stepped toward him to run a line. Only a line, nothing more. But she moved so slowly, so deliberately, that Richard felt something inside him tighten. She leaned in just close enough for her breath to brush his cheek. He said it felt like someone opened a doorway to the room he was not supposed to enter. He forgot the next line, a line he had practiced over and over, a line he could recite backward. It slipped right out of his brain as if Diane stole it with her eyes. Richard confessed that Diane Lane made him nervous. And Richard Gere is not a man who gets nervous. Not at 25, not at 40, not at 70. But Diane had that effect. She made him aware of his own heartbeat, aware of how close she was, aware of how easy it would have been to let instinct lead instead of professionalism. There were scenes where she would place a hand on his chest, barely touching him. That small contact felt like a lit match dropped onto dry grass, slow at first, then spreading fast, too fast. Richard said it took everything in him not to step out of character, not to lean in an inch too far, not to let the moment become something unscripted, unplanned, and unforgettable for the wrong reasons. He said Diane had the kind of allure that did not scream. It breathed, it whispered, it curled around a man like smoke from a candle just blown out. And once it wrapped around you, you were done. He ended his confession in a voice lower than before, almost quiet enough to miss. If Diane Lane had leaned in 1 inch more during any of those scenes, the entire shoot would have had to stop. And not for technical reasons, for reasons no studio handbook prepares you for. To Richard, Diane was not just temptation. She was the kind of fire a man touches knowing he will burn, and touches anyway. 3. Michelle Pfeiffer. The room changes when her name is spoken. Not loud, not dramatic, but in a subtle way, like someone dim on the lights without touching the switch. Richard Gere does not smile right away the way he did with Julia or Diane. Instead, he exhales, slow, controlled, as if preparing himself for a memory that still knows exactly how to sting. Michelle Pfeiffer was not the kind of woman who walked into a room to be admired. She was the kind who walked in and made every man reconsider the meaning of self-control. She carried a kind of cool, quiet power, an elegance so sharp it felt like it could cut you without leaving a mark. Richard said the first time he met her, he felt something shift under his ribs. Not attraction, something deeper, something more disarming. Michelle had a way of looking at people that made them feel seen and evaluated at the same time. Her eyes did not search. They understood. And men, even the confident ones, did not always know where to put their hands when she looked at them like that. Her beauty was not soft. It was precise, the kind of beauty architects admire. All angles and balance and control. Yet beneath that polished calm, there was something else, something that flickered, something wild that only showed itself in quiet moments between words. Richard remembered being near her during an early project meeting. No cameras, no costumes, just a conference room and a stack of scripts. Michelle leaned over the table to point out a line, and Richard swore he felt time slow down by half. Not because she touched him. She did not even close. It was the way she breathed, the way she held her body, the way her presence filled the space without trying. He said Michelle had a voltage that did not spark outward like Julia's, and did not burn like Diane's, but hummed beneath the surface like a hidden wire. You never saw it. You felt it. And feeling it was worse, because once you sensed it, you could not forget it. During moments on set, she had a habit of pausing before delivering a line. A tiny pause, only a breath long, but that breath carried weight. It made her co-star feel like they were standing on the edge of something they had no business approaching. Richard admitted that he would stay so staring at her profile while she rehearsed. Her focus was intense, almost intimidating. Yet the more intimidating she became, the more he wanted to step closer. It was an instinct he kept buried, but it pulsed in him every time she turned her head in his direction. She had a smile that did not reveal everything at once, a smile that suggested she knew far more than she ever said. And Richard, a man who had seen every kind of charm in Hollywood, found himself wondering what it would take to earn the full version of that smile. There was one afternoon he remembered clearly. Late day, golden light leaking through a studio window. Michelle stood a few feet away reading her notes. She brushed her hair behind her ear, a small ordinary gesture, but Richard said the simplicity of it nearly broke him. It was too natural, too intimate for a workday. It made him think of quiet kitchens, Sunday mornings, the kind of life he was never brave enough to chase. He confessed softly that Michelle Pfeiffer had a presence that felt like a locked room. You wanted to open the door. You wanted to know what lived inside. But you also sensed that if you crossed that threshold, you might never want to leave. In his interview, he leaned back and said in a voice almost too low for the microphone to catch that if Michelle had ever given him permission with even the smallest gesture, he would have followed her without hesitation, not because he lacked discipline, but because she embodied a kind of mystery no discipline could override. To Richard, Michelle was the temptation of the unknown. Not fire, not lightning, but a hidden ocean you fall into without making a sound. 4. Susan Sarandon. When her name surfaces. Richard Gere does not smile in the soft, guilty way he did for Julia, nor does he laugh the way he did with Diane. Instead, he tilts his head back just slightly, as if bracing for a gust of wind he remembers well. His expression carries a familiar mix of admiration and surrender, because Susan Sarandon was not the kind of woman you simply liked or admired. She was the kind you felt, the kind who walked into a room and made the air itself take shape around her. Susan had fire, but not the kind that flares wild. Her fire was steady, controlled, like the flame of a lantern guiding someone through the dark. She spoke with a confidence that made every man straighten his posture without even noticing he had done it. And she looked at people with eyes that seemed to know exactly where their truths were buried. Richard said he first saw her in person during a charity event in the late 80s. The room was packed with actors, directors, executives, everyone buzzing with the usual Hollywood noise. But when Susan entered, the noise did not stop. It simply rearranged itself around her. Conversations softened, heads turned. Even people who pretended not to look, looked. She moved like a woman who had never once apologized for existing. That, Richard admitted, was the first crack in his composure. Working with her later only made the effect stronger. Susan had a presence that did not ask for space. It claimed it. She spoke with warmth but carried steel under every sentence. She did not flirt. She did not charm. She simply existed with so much force that charm became unnecessary. On set, she had a habit of tossing her hair back when she was thinking, a small motion. But Richard said that single gesture made him feel like he had suddenly done something wrong, even when he had not. Her confidence shook him, not because it was aggressive, but because it was absolute. There was a rehearsal one afternoon he remembered too vividly. They were practicing a scene where their characters were supposed to argue. Nothing intimate, nothing seductive, just tension. But when Susan stepped closer, closing the distance between them, Richard felt every rehearsed emotion get swallowed by something raw and unfiltered. She looked at him with those sharp, fearless eyes, not angry, not soft, something in between. And Richard said he felt his pulse jump like a man being called out by someone who knew him better than he knew himself. He forgot half the line. The other half came out slower than it should have. The director thought he was being dramatic. He was not. He was simply overwhelmed. Susan had this rare ability to make you feel exposed without touching you. She could make a man wonder if she was reading his thoughts or daring him to speak them out loud. Richard said it was thrilling in a way he could not admit while filming. Thrilling and dangerous. What made her so irresistible was not just beauty, it was conviction. It was intelligence sharpened to a point. It was the sense that she would not just challenge you, she would expect you to rise to meet her. And if you could not, she would not soften her standards. She would simply move on. There was one lunch break he recalled. Warm day, outdoor table, Susan leaning back in her chair, sunglasses pushed up in her hair. She laughed at something a crew member said. And Richard, who had seen every kind of beauty Hollywood could offer, felt something slip inside him. He said that moment felt like standing on the edge of something bright and forbidden, like looking over a cliff and realizing you wanted to jump just to see what falling felt like. Many years later, during the interview, he finally admitted it. Susan Sarandon made him want to break rules. Not big rules, human rules. The rules of distance, the rules of professionalism. The rules men invent to keep themselves out of trouble. And he said if she had ever leaned in with an invitation even the size of a whisper, every rule would have collapsed under his feet. To Richard, Susan was not temptation. She was permission. The kind a man does not ask for. The kind he feels in his bones. 5. Sharon Stone. When her name enters the conversation, Richard Gere does not soften or sigh. He reacts differently. His eyebrows lift just a little, the corners of his mouth tilt upward, and his whole posture shifts into something alert, like a man who just heard the growl of an engine he remembers very well. Sharon Stone does not belong to the same category as the others. She is not warmth. She is not nostalgia. She is voltage. Richard said the first time he saw her in person was at an industry event in the early 90s. The room was loud, shimmering with the usual Hollywood chatter. Then Sharon walked in, and something in the space seemed to freeze for half a second. Not long enough to be obvious, but long enough for every man nearby to feel his heartbeat flip. Sharon had the kind of presence that did not float or glide. It struck. She moved with a sharp, measured grace, like someone who understood the power of angles and timing. Her eyes carried a clarity that made men straighten their backs out of instinct. There was confidence in her every step, but beneath that confidence was danger. Real danger. The kind a man wants to test even though he knows better. During the height of her fame, around the time Basic Instinct became a cultural earthquake, Sharon was talked about as if she were a force of nature. Richard admitted that the reputation was accurate. She was a storm in human form, cold at the edges, bright in the center, capable of flipping a room upside down with a single look. He said being near her felt like standing beside a machine humming at full speed. The energy was not loud. It was focused, sharp, and aimed directly at whoever she decided to notice. And when Sharon Stone noticed a man, he felt it everywhere. Not in the playful way Julia did, not in the smoldering way Diane did, not in the steady challenge of Susan. Sharon hit differently, like ice cracking under your feet. Like holding something you know could cut you but refusing to put it down. There was a night he remembered clearly. The two of them ended up at the same small gathering after an awards show. Low lights, late hour. Sharon was sitting on a sofa talking to a director when she glanced over her shoulder and caught Richard watching her from across the room. She did not smile. She did not nod. She just held his gaze for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Richard said it felt like being scanned, evaluated, measured, and for a moment he was not the charming gentleman Hollywood adored. He was a man wondering if he was brave enough to walk toward the very thing that made his pulse trip over itself. Working with her on later projects only confirmed it. She carried intelligence like a concealed blade. Sharp, quick, always ready. Her lines were delivered with precision, and her pauses could silence a crew. When she leaned close to whisper something to him between takes, even if it was just a note about lighting or timing, he said the moment always landed deeper than it had any right to. Sharon had a rare gift. She could make a man feel both chosen and threatened. She could pull someone in with warmth and push him back with fire. Richard found himself unusually aware of her breath, the way she turned her head, the cold edge of her confidence. He said she reminded him of a beautiful knife, perfect to look at, dangerous to touch, impossible to ignore. There was one rehearsal where she placed a hand on his shoulder to adjust their blocking. Just a hand, just a moment. But Richard felt his stomach drop as if the room tilted. He said the contact was nothing, but the effect was everything. It made him realize that Sharon Stone did not have to try to be seductive. She was seductive the way a flame is hot. It simply exists that way. Later in his interview, Richard finally admitted what everyone suspected, but he never said out loud. If Sharon Stone had ever leaned in close and said a single word that hinted at something more, he would have followed the impulse without hesitation. He would not have weighed consequences. He would not have thought about headlines or careers. He would have done what every other man in that room would have done. He would have stepped straight into the fire. To Richard, Sharon was not just danger. She was the thrill of nearly losing control and loving him every second of the fall. 6. Sophia Loren. When her name is mentioned, Richard Gere does not laugh, smirk, or shift with playful guilt. He grows still, completely still, as if someone just placed a relic in front of him. His eyes lower, his breath deepens, and for a moment he looks less like a Hollywood icon remembering a co-star and more like a man recalling the single moment he realized beauty could be a kind of gravity. Sophia Loren was not a crush. She was not a spark. She was not even a temptation. She was an era, a phenomenon, a presence so powerful that men did not simply admire her. They aligned themselves to her. Richard said that in her prime, she had a glow that did not come from youth, makeup, or fame. It came from something older, something ancient, something passed down by goddesses and storms. He first saw her in person in the late 1990s at an award tribute. The ballroom was filled with legends, dozens of them. And yet, when Sophia entered, the temperature in the room shifted. Conversations thinned, eyes turned. It was not dramatic. It was instinctive. Like everyone sensed a force moving through the doorway and their bodies responded before their minds did. She walked with calm confidence, not arrogance. Every step she took seemed to carry stories that did not need to be told. Her posture spoke of decades of triumph. Her eyes carried a softness that hid 1,000 storms, and her smile looked like the kind that could comfort a child or destroy a grown man, depending on her intention. Richard remembered standing across the room holding a drink he suddenly forgot to lift. Sophia was wearing a simple black gown that did not scream for attention. It did not need to. Her presence did the work. She spoke to guests with warmth, never rushed, never hurried, as if time itself slowed down to match her pace. He said the moment she looked his way, even from a distance, he felt something inside him shift, like a curtain being pulled open. Not because she intended anything, but because Sophia Loren looked at people the way some people look at art, fully, kindly, thoroughly. Later that evening, she approached him to congratulate him on a recent role. Richard said his brain processed her words, but his heart was dealing with something else entirely. The closeness of her, the grace of her movements, the softness of her voice. Her presence felt like stepping inside a cathedral and remembering you should not speak too loudly. He admitted that Sophia had an energy unlike anyone he ever met. She was sensual without trying, wise without lecturing, playful without pretending. Her confidence felt carved, shaped by years of surviving an industry that tried to consume her and failing every time. During a quieter moment at the event, Sophia stood beside him near a balcony entrance. Soft lights, soft breeze, soft everything. She mentioned something about the importance of choosing roles that speak to the soul. And Richard said the way she said the word soul made him forget an entire sentence he was planning to respond with. He was not a young man then, not easily impressed, not easily shaken, and yet he said he felt 17 years old again. Unsure, breath held, mind racing to keep up with a woman who seemed carved from legends. Sophia had that rare combination, beauty mixed with gravity, warmth mixed with authority, softness wrapped around steel. She was the kind of woman who made a man want to say yes before he even knew the question. Years later, in his interview, Richard let the truth land with quiet force. If Sophia Loren had ever leaned in and whispered his name, he would have moved without thinking, through crowds, through noise, through anything in his way. Not out of desire alone, but out of the pull she carried. A pull that felt older than film, older than fame. To Richard, Sophia was not simply unforgettable. She was the dream a man never expects to live and never manages to shake. When we listen to Richard Gere confess these moments of longing, admiration, and quiet vulnerability, it becomes clear that this story is not really about desire. It is about something far deeper. It is about the people who cross our paths and leave a mark on us that time never fully erases. The women on his list were not simply beautiful faces from an era of Hollywood glamour. They were mirrors. They reflected back to him the pieces of himself he could not see alone. Youth, curiosity, wonder, temptation, fear, and sometimes the truth that even the most composed person can be shaken by the right presence. There is a lesson in that. Every person we meet carries a kind of energy, and some people hold a force we do not understand until much later. Sometimes they teach us something without saying a word. Sometimes they remind us that the heart does not follow rules, and attraction does not respect perfect timing. And sometimes they appear for no reason except to remind us that we are human, imperfect, curious, hungry for connection that feels real. Richard's stories remind us that it is possible to be strong and still moved, famous and still uncertain, grown and still caught off guard by someone's smile. There is value in admitting that. There is value in being honest about the people who change us quietly, even if nothing ever happened, even if it was only a moment, a glance, a thought. This video is not about scandal. It is about memory. It is about the way certain people stay with us, whether through chemistry on a movie set, the weight of shared work, or the spark of something that never became real, but felt real enough to remember. If you take anything from Richard Gere's confessions, let it be this. Life is shaped by the people we cross paths with, not just the ones we hold. And sometimes the most powerful connections are the ones we never acted on, the ones that lived only in the space between imagination and restraint. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If you enjoyed this journey through old Hollywood and the emotions behind the scenes, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story like this. And before you go, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I would love to know which corner of the world you are joining us from today. From today.